So the topic is the top sublimation challenges and how to resolve them. My name is Jimmy Lamb. I am Manager of Education for Sawgrass, and I am ready to roll, so let's go. All right, the challenges of decoration, regardless of what form of product decoration, you're always going to have some challenges. You know, I started as an embroiderer. We had challenges there. I know screen printers, they had challenges too. So everybody that's in this business, not just sublimators, run into these kind of challenges, but that's okay. We can try to identify the challenges and then track down ways to resolve them. Sublimation, overall, is a pretty simple process, but it's like anything else. There is some learning involved. And part of that learning is building up a knowledge base of your own. That knowledge base may be completely stored in your head, but more than likely and hopefully your knowledge base becomes more of somewhere that you go to get resource information. And I would hope that a lot of that would be the Sawgrass website, because we have a tremendous amount of information there to help you out. Be careful of some sources like the internet. The internet's great because there's lots of people and information, right? The question is it the right information? Unfortunately, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes on the internet, we have people who don't know anything trying to help other people who don't know anything, and that can be disastrous. So you do have to be careful. I mean, I've heard some really crazy things on the internet that, people just thought it was great and jumped on it, and it was a horrendous solution. It wasn't a solution at all. It's going to cause more problems. So what I'm getting at is, when you're building your knowledge base, when you're looking for information, go to reliable sources, and that typically is a manufacturer's site. So if you're having a problem with a substrate, go to the manufacturer of that substrate. If you think you're having a problem with your inks and printers, we always encourage you to contact your dealer first. Most of them do have a good tech support staff, but we're available for you as well, and there's never any charge for the call, so please keep that in mind, okay? All right, so how do you deal with challenges? As I was mentioning, the degree of knowledge is so important, because the fact you're able to stop and start thinking through what is the problem, what's causing it, or what is potentially causing it, how do I narrow it down? I call this process of troubleshooting a sublimation toolbox. And I'm not necessarily talking about a big red box, okay? I'm talking about having tools that can help you troubleshoot. Some of that's a knowledge base, some of that may be real items like hygrometers, and that's for checking humidity, thermometers for checking your shop temperature, different things of that nature can help you with troubleshooting. So understanding how it all works, though, is what's important, and what we're going to try and go through here, okay? Now, troubleshooting is a process. One of my degrees is actually in electronics engineering, and so I used to, some people already know this, not everyone, I used to calibrate nuclear reactor safety systems before I got into this kind of work, okay? And so troubleshooting was something we did, routinely. We were, trained in that. But troubleshooting is something you would use for anything that comes your way, okay? And these are the basic steps for troubleshooting, okay? Identify the problem. What is happening and when did it start? Probably the most important question of all, when did it start? Create a list of possible causes. Did you change anything before the problem started? Okay, and there's a lot of little variables in sublimation if you think about it. There's ink, there's paper, there's image files, software settings, the substrate, heat press settings, the environment, the temperature, the humidity. All those things can affect your printing. Then try to narrow it down and determine the most likely cause, okay? Because you'll probably have a big list, and you want to narrow it down as quick as you can to, a smaller list. And a lot of times this is just changing one parameter at a time and seeing if the results have changed. Once you've done that and you've narrowed it down, then identify, what is probably the solution to your problem, and then go test that solution. You think, okay, I think this is it, but let's go test it and make sure, and then finally document the results. So many times I'm guilty of this. We don't write it down. Oh, I'll remember that. You know what? You don't remember that, and a year later when it comes up again, you start from scratch. So these things are important. Take the time to scratch out the details on paper, as you troubleshoot, and then file that away somewhere, either electronically or in a file cabinet or something, so that you can go back to it in the future if you need it. All right. Through this process, we're going to talk about common sublimation challenges. And here's the 5 common challenges that we will cover. Color issues, banding, moisture issues, ghosting and gassing out, and transfer lines on apparel. So let's start with the color issue, specifically incorrect colors, okay? How do you troubleshoot this? Well, it's one of the most frustrating issues in any form of digital printing, not just sublimation, because there's so many different variables. For example, if you took the same image and printed it out on a sublimation printer and a DTG printer, I guarantee the colors will be different, even though it was the same image, and that's how the systems are processing the ink. You know, there are times when you can put the same image in two almost identical printers and still get a little bit of variation. That's because there's more to it than just that, okay? We're also dealing with a lot of other little variables. So, you know, there is some challenges there because of the variables. And then you have to figure out kind of like, what do you do to fix it? So let's talk about troubleshooting color, okay? If you're printing something and the colors don't seem correct, now first off, you're brand spanking new. If you're brand new, make sure you understand that the colors you see when you print are not the colors you'll see after you press it, okay? Once we go through the heat press phase, that's when we get the correct color. So just keep that in mind. If you first time you print something out, you're going to look at it and say, these colors are wrong. Okay, well, they're only going to be wrong until you actually press it onto something. All right, so assuming, though, that you're pressing and producing products, the first question you always ask is, okay, this doesn't look right, okay? So try to identify why it doesn't look right, and then ask the question, when did it start? Now this is important because of all the different things that can affect this. For example, if you just started using a new set of ink and you didn't have the problem before, then maybe you want to focus on the ink. If you just bought this substrate and haven't used it before, it might be the substrate. If you just switch brands of transfer paper, it could be the transfer paper. So you want to kind of think about the last time it looked right, you know, where's it look now today? And here's another thing. Print that same image on different products and see if the problem follows the image or it changes with the products. You see, that'll tell you a lot right off the bat. If the colors are correct on a metal photo panel, but then when you put the same image on a wooden plaque, coated of course, and the colors look different, then that's probably the substrate, not the actual image, okay, or the printing itself. So I mean, there's ways to kind of, you know, narrow this down. So you go through all those troubleshooting steps like that, okay. But the first and most important thing is, when did it start? Okay, because that helps us track it down. Hey, if everything printed fine on Friday and you go in on Monday and it's not printing correctly, and you didn't change anything over the weekend, well, the question becomes, what about the temperature and humidity? Did they change? There are, you know, just certain settings for those, ideally, for the sublimation environment. So that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of different little things there that can affect it, okay? All right, so to troubleshoot this, start with that knowledge base, you know, asking these questions and then understanding, you know, what could be causing that. Here are the most likely causes, not necessarily in order, just because I put it that way because it looks pretty. See how it's kind of angled, everything, you know? Okay, so anyway, here are the most likely causes when you're having a color issue: ink, paper, substrate, printer settings, heat press settings, color management settings. What are the most likely causes? Heat press is one of the top causes, okay? If you take a heat press and you vary the temperature 10 degrees, you can vary the image, okay? You can vary the color in the image. So you always have to make sure, is my heat press operating properly? Is it the right parameters? They make something called a digital pyrometer, and a digital pyrometer is a device where you can actually measure the temperature on the platen of the heat press. And what I would recommend that you do is go to the manufacturer of your heat press and ask them what they suggest is the best device for measuring that temperature, and then periodically verify the temperature on the heat press is the same as what the indicator is reading. Also make sure it's consistent across the heat press surface, okay? Pressure. Changing your pressure can have an impact on the image as well. Though in general, if you're using a good mid-range pressure, it works pretty well for most products. I would look at heat first, okay, and the timing as well. But a lot of times the heat is one that I really go for first to make sure that everything is in spec the right way. Also pay attention, and if this is a new substrate, it may have some different settings. I mean, we get used to it being 400 degrees medium pressure for 1 minute, but that's not what's, you know, you apply in every situation. So pay close attention, especially if you go into ceramics. Anything ceramic, we have to do it for a longer period of time. So you do want to, you know, pay attention to that. What about your color management settings? You know, a lot of people have our systems, but they don't understand how they work. If some of you have Power Driver, for example, well, every time you print through Power Driver, there are some basic settings in there that you need to make. If you're using Creative Studio Print and Color Manager, there's some basic settings in there. Not a lot, just a few in there. But with either system, you do need to identify what is this type of substrate that you're printing on. What is the paper that you're using? Different brands of paper have different absorption rates, and how they absorb and release that ink can affect the colorization of it, which can affect the color. Okay, it's not a huge thing when you switch paper, but it could be contributing to that. We also recommend that you choose whether it's a photographic or a graphic image, again, so the color management system is taking care of it the right way. But I would say after heat press settings, probably your substrate becomes the next one that you really start looking closely at, because different substrates come from different manufacturers. Most of the substrates have a white coating, but if it's they're not all the same white, especially if you look at apparel versus some of the other products. So if you have a different color, different shade of white, when you put color on it, it can actually affect that color to some degree. We also find that some products, just their different coatings respond differently to different things. Okay. Printer settings, there could be some things there, and that's where our tech support really comes in well, because our tech support is going to walk through and ask you questions. If you allow them, they can usually go online and connect to your system and take a look at different settings within the printer and the color management to help track down all of that for you. So that's what I'm talking about, learning kind of how different things affect it. And one of the ways that you learn is experiment. If you have the time, and this is going to cost a little bit of money, okay, because you're going to use a little bit of ink and you're going to use some substrates. But if you have the time to experiment, take an image and then press it on the same substrate at different temperature settings. It maybe vary by 10 degrees. If you're looking for something inexpensive, just get a white t-shirt, a 100% polyester white t-shirt, but put the image on at 400 degrees, 390, 380, and then take a look at it and see what the difference looks like. And that's kind of teaching yourself, of what it looks like when the temperature is off, okay? You can do the same thing with the timing. Usually you're going to have to go pretty broad range in the timing. Maybe you go 30 seconds, a minute and a half, and see what that does. So see, the beauty of something like a t-shirt is you can press it in multiple places, okay? So you can use one shirt and put in multiple pressings. And the same thing with varying the pressure and kind of see what happens. Part of it, what we're doing is we're just troubleshooting to see what happens, okay? So that there's sort of a learning, curve going on there. It's interesting, I was demonstrating in one of the workshops I do on transfers and that type of thing, and I was demonstrating the fact that with sublimation, we can't print on dark colors because we can't see the sublimation. So we took a black shirt and we printed something that was green and you could actually see it, and people actually liked it. I mean, it was like, wow, that would be great at Halloween. It did work. It was a bizarre looking color, but it was like a special effect. So, and actually through troubleshooting, we created a special effect that was kind of neat too. So those are some of the things you can do to help yourself. If you have the opportunity, experiment with different settings and document it. By the way, only change one setting at a time. If you're doing troubleshooting, you think it's the heat press, don't change the temperature and the pressure and the time, because then you don't know which one fixed the problem or made it worse. So that's something you got to do, one thing at a time. But anytime you have some downtime, do some experimentation on there and see what those parameters look like. So then we go back and we just start putting all that back into these questions. When did it first occur? All right. When did it first occur? When I changed something. What was it that I changed? Okay, can we change it back? Is it something new and different? Does the problem only occur on one substrate, or does it only occur with one image? Those are the kind of things that you're looking at, because then you can quickly narrow it down. And being able to narrow it down makes it, so that you're getting to the root cause as fast as you possibly can. So, these are the certain little questions I'm asking, like here. Does it happen with all images or only certain ones? Does it happen with all substrates or only certain ones? Does it happen in the same area of the job? Now, that's a little different. If you start seeing a flaw in like every image on every substrate, but ask the next question, is it in the same area every time? If it's in the same area, there's probably a problem with your heat press. if it's in the same area, you may have a cold spot in that heat press where the temperature is off, or you may have a warped platen where you're not getting equal pressure there. So there are little indicators that you can see when you look at the repeatability of the problem to help track it down. Okay, so that's the kind of things you got to do here on that troubleshooting. Then you make that list of possible causes. So that just means you try something and you write down the result. You write it down, and you should start to see a pattern. Okay, look at different patterns there that are happening, and this is just some of that references of the things that can happen here. When you talk about ink issues, which I hadn't mentioned a lot of, but typically the number one ink issue we see is when someone's using ink that's pretty far past the use by date. That can affect the colorization of the ink. It can also cause maybe some things like banding to occur, which we'll talk about banding specifically in just a minute. So these are, those possible causes that you work through. Once you have the possible causes, then you narrow it down to the most likely cause from all of those lists. And then again, there's a lot of things here. I'm just trying to give you that basic understanding of troubleshooting, and especially in this case in regards to color. Okay, but check these different things out. Contact tech support, read online any of the troubleshooting recommendations, and then try to follow it through. Identify the solution, as we've mentioned, and as I keep saying, carefully vary one parameter at a time and note the results. Okay, a little bit at a time, see what happens. And then once we're done with that, we want to test it. In other words, go back to where we had the problem and see if the changes have made the solution or proven the solution, and then maybe try it out on a couple of different products just to make sure that you're consistent with that solution. And of course, document everything. Okay, document the causes, what you did, and what the results were. So going back to incorrect colors, one of the first really if the incorrect colors are occurring, stop and say, did something change? Okay, I mean, that's your starting point, Ralph, because I can tell you a lot. New substrate, color problem. Okay, it's probably the substrate. I mean, as simple as that, it's probably the substrate. But you can certainly look then, am I using the right pressing parameters for that substrate? If it occurs in the middle of a job and nothing had changed, and all of a sudden you start seeing issues like that, that may be going back to the heat press. I mean, heat presses can get hotter as they go through the day. And what I mean by that is when we're constantly pressing, we have heat that's actually going through into the bottom of the heat press as well, so we may have more heat radiating out as we go. There's other little things, and this comes from that knowledge base. Some people have gone around and start trying to preheat some of the products they're going to press, and that is not something you want to do with sublimation. There are other processes out there where they tell you to preheat something. For example, a shirt. If you're using a plastisol transfer, a lot of times they tell you to preheat the shirt, for like 5 to 10 seconds before you apply it. Don't do that with sublimation. If you preheat something and then you actually lay on top of it a transfer, that transfer can start gassing right then. And then if you move the transfer, it can give you a blurry image. So you want to make sure that what you're pressing is cool to begin with. And again, if you're heating up that bottom platen through continuous pressing, it may be if you dropped a shirt on there and you walked away for some reason and the shirt's heating up just from that residual heat. I mean, I'm just throwing those things out there because a lot of times we don't really think about that much. Also, watch your temperature. Be in the habit of watching the temperature. It is going to vary. When you close the heat press and you start heating, you're transferring heat from the platen to the shirt, so therefore it starts to drop, and then of course the heating elements kick in to bring it back up. And then when we open it up, it's usually at a lower temperature than when we started. If you're in a real cold environment, it may have a long time to heat back up. So I mean, these are just things that can be happening through the day to keep in mind. Okay, but colors can be frustrating. We understand that. You're running into, you do some basic troubleshooting, you're not solving it, call tech support. Okay, that can help you with that. I mean, I know I hear, about the black not being exactly the black that we want, or I also hear about sometimes reds can be a little challenging, some of the reds, but we have different ways of varying some of the colors so that we can try and increase our reds, for example, or the percentage of red. So there are things that can be done. Okay, so spend time with tech support, learn from them. with that. Learn how your color management tools work as well. You can learn more about color management because we have all kinds of resources under our webcast. So if you want to learn more about color management, go online to our resource center and check out some of the other webcasts from other things that we've done. But always feel free to call tech support. Can't emphasize that enough. Okay, after color, banding is one of the things that we see. It has nothing to do with musicians. But here's a good picture of what banding looks like. This is vertical banding. You see the little lines that are in the image. Basically, we have missing ink. The most likely cause is clogged nozzles in the print head. It's not the only cause, okay? Running out of ink can cause the same issue, and old ink can contribute as well. So we want to, you know, it's just like drinking milk, okay? You want fresh milk. You don't want to drink milk that's past the use-by date. And the same thing with ink. I mean, ink doesn't automatically go bad on the use-by date. It's not like a light switch. But do pay attention. As ink gets, you know, older and older and older, it may not give you quite the colors that you were looking for. And that's just, unfortunately, you know, shelf life of inks. And it's not just with sublimation inks. That's with any type of digital printing ink. All right, but definitely if we have things getting clogged, we start to see the streaking. So how do we prevent that from happening? Now, if you have a Ricoh printer or you have one of our Virtuoso SGs, the SG400, SG800, they do have a maintenance program in there. And if you leave it plugged in and turned on and you set it up properly, because you can actually set up the frequency of how much it does this, it will do periodic head checks. Now, when you're doing a head check, you're actually going to use a little bit. It won't use a lot, but it will use a little bit. So the key here to prevent things from clogging is to use your ink, okay? The key thing here is keep the ink flowing, all right? Keep that ink flowing. And if you're not printing a lot, then make sure it's powered up and it's doing its routine head maintenance programs. If you're unsure about that, contact tech support. They'll tell you how you set that up or verify that it is doing what it's supposed to. All right? Keep up with ink levels in your printer. I mean, it's very easy to check the ink levels. Again, with the Ricohs and the SGs, you can do it right there on the screen. You can also do it through Power Driver. You can also do it through Create Studio Print and Color Manager. So, you know, pay attention. When it starts to get low, make sure you have, you know, another cartridge of ink, because you don't want it to like run out in the middle of an important job. I don't recommend that you keep a whole lot of ink on hand unless you are doing enough production that you're routinely using up ink, because of the fact that there is a use-by date on there. And some people can go months and months with the same set of ink. Others may be using it up, you know, over a couple of weeks. But you always should have one set available, especially when you start to see it get low, on hand so that you can make that quick changeover if you do start to run out. Also, pay attention to those use-by dates. They're printed on the ink cartridges. I mean, if you open up and look at your ink cartridge, it should be staring you right there in the face. So, you know, I would make a note of that. Just be aware of that. So, you know that, because that's going to be something you'll get asked if you contact tech support for a number of different issues. They're going to ask you about, you know, the ink date. Oh, by the way, if you happen to be, you know, we do support some of the Epson printers. If you happen to be using an Epson printer, they don't typically have that head maintenance program in there. And in fact, some of them that do, there have been some problems with it. So what we suggest when you're using one of the Epsons, that you routinely just do a manual head check. You know, you do it like every other day or whatever, so that that's taking place. It doesn't happen by itself. And if you let it sit and sit and sit, you know, the inks can cause you some problems by clogging the heads and it starts to streak. Now, by the way, if you do see the streaking, okay, check your ink level first, make sure you got plenty of ink, and then do a manual head cleaning. And you can do that from the front panel of your printer. You can also, if you're using some of our color management tools like the Power Driver and the Create Studio Print and Color Manager, you do have printer utilities that you can go into the utilities and you can tell it to do head cleaning. Okay. Now, when it does a head cleaning, after you do a head cleaning, you're gonna print out a sheet of paper, which is our nozzle check, and on the nozzle check, you'll see 4 little bands of color, and each box of color has little squiggly lines in it. Those squiggly lines should not be broken. Okay, they should be, you know, solid from left to right, little squiggly lines, okay, within each box. If they're broken, that means that you still have an issue with that particular color nozzle. So it's going to print in black, cyan, magenta, and yellow, okay, to correspond with those 4 color nozzles. So if everything looks connected properly with those little squiggly lines, your heads are okay. If not, you're probably going to do the head cleaning. Don't do endless head cleanings. I would say that if you did 3 head cleanings and you cannot get all those lines solid, then stop and call tech support. Remember, every head cleaning uses up a little bit of ink. So at a certain point, you call for help. Nothing wrong with that. Moisture issues. Again, our environment can cause a lot of issues, and if you've never seen what moisture can do, it can do some very interesting things. I have a little box down here at the bottom, and you'll see that on these stripes, you'll see some little white, you know, flaky, speckled areas, okay? Those white areas was where there was moisture, and when the moisture was heated up under that heat press at 400 degrees, it caused some steam issues, which in this case displaced some of the ink. Now, we'll see steam routinely because there's always some moisture in what you're working with. It's extreme moisture that causes problems. A little bit of moisture usually has little or no effect whatsoever. But you want to make sure that key aspects of your equipment are taken care of in an environment where we have reduced levels of moisture. I know a lot of people run businesses out of their garages and out of their basements, and those can be very damp places. So it really won't hurt a heat press, okay? But it's these other things that can absorb it. And the most common things that can absorb it, of course, are the papers and your substrates, okay? So transfer paper, that's a good one for catching moisture. Even hard substrates, believe it or not, can get some moisture in the surface. Soft substrates can get a lot, and apparel being a good example of that. So you got to pay attention to your environment, what's the relative humidity, and you can get that from our tech support, what the relative humidity is or what it should be, and you want to maintain it within that environment. Now, I want you to keep this part in mind. With the relative humidity, the humidity levels that are desirable for printers and ink may not be desirable for things like transfer paper. Printers and ink typically like higher levels of humidity, but higher levels of humidity can be contributing to issues with some of these other products. Now, if you're working in an environmentally controlled area, then you can use a hygrometer to measure the amount of humidity in the air, and then you can adjust your environmental equipment to maintain within that range. If you're unable to do that, then you might consider, listen, I'm going to store my substrates, okay, especially if you're working out of your home. I'm going to store my substrates and papers maybe inside the house where they are in a protected environment that I can control, even though I'm doing my pressing outside in the garage. You know, you can even do the printing in the house too, because again, printers and ink are, you know, concerned about humidity and temperature, whereas the heat press really isn't. So quite a few people have realized that we'll just do all the printing and preparation in the house and take it out to the garage or the basement where the environment's a little different. You can also preheat some things too, to help, but well, I'm going to define that because I told you don't preheat, okay? So let me define what I mean by that, okay, before I get myself in trouble. If you suspect that you have moisture in a substrate, there's nothing wrong with applying a heat to it. I wouldn't necessarily close the heat press all the way, but I'd bring it down to almost being closed for maybe 5 seconds, and that helps maybe burn off some of the moisture. It also makes the surface hot, so once you open it back up, let it cool back down before you actually apply your transfer to that surface. You don't want to put a transfer down on a hot surface. Okay. Now I know a lot of times with shirts, even we use it to press out the wrinkles, and again, nothing wrong with that. You know, press out the wrinkles of the shirt, but then take it back and let it cool before you put the transfer on it. In fact, if you have a dozen shirts to do, you might as well just go ahead and press every shirt to get the wrinkles out, and then carefully stack them over to the side and allowing them to cool back down before you start actually pressing onto them. So that's what I mean about the preheat. We used to say to store your papers, etc., into Ziploc plastic bags, but it turns out that those actually can hold moisture. So the Ziploc bags may not be the best way to store it. The key is to put your papers and substrates in a cool, dry place. okay? A cool, dry place. Forget putting them in the Ziploc bags, okay? That's just not really the way to do it, okay? And then also routinely check humidity levels. You may have to invest in a dehumidifier or a humidifier, depending on which part of the country you live in. So, pay attention to those types of things. Then we have ghosting and gassing out. Now, ghosting is when you see a blurry image, usually somewhere within the image. Not the whole image is blurry, but there's blurred lines. For example, if we look at this lettering here, the small white lettering, and you look inside on the white, you'll actually see some black, almost looking like, well, it's almost more like a dark gray than a black. But the more you look at it, you start to realize that probably doesn't belong there. And here, I want you to look really closely at the H. Look at the little pattern in the H, this little gray area right here and right here. What does it look like? The black area right here, okay? And that's exactly what it is. Some of the black ink that was supposed to be here in the center of the H ended up over here on the far left of the H in a very faint color, but it's there. That's why we call it ghosting, because it looks ghostly, right? And you can start to figure out the same thing happen on the I, and almost all the letters over here, you'll see that there's pieces of the letters have been reproduced. Very clear on the end. See this little V part here? That's that, okay? Ended up in the wrong place. If you look at the red letters down here, you can see the same thing too. The outline on this edge ended up right there. What this meant was that while the transfer paper was hot, it somehow moved across the surface of what we were printing on, okay? And that's what causes ghosting. Ghosting pretty much happens when the transfer paper moves. Now let's think about that. If the heat press is closed, by the way, it has to move and be hot. So if the heat press is closed, it's hot, but it can't move because the pressure is holding it in place. If you put a substrate in the heat press and put the transfer down on top and the substrate's cool, it doesn't matter if the transfer moves all day long. It's not going to affect anything because the surface is cool. The sublimation hasn't happened. So it has to be the two elements together. It has to be hot and it has to move. When can that happen? When you open the heat press. That's pretty much the only time that can happen, unless you preheat something and drop a transfer sheet on top of it, then it can start ghosting. But provided you're doing things the right way, the only time you really see ghosting is when you open the heat press. When you open the heat press, when you're putting pressure down on the products and the paper, your pressure is holding everything in place, but it's actually compressing everything. So when we open the heat press, it releases the pressure and then it decompresses, and in that case the paper starts to lift upwards. In fact, there's almost like a vacuum effect when we open that heat press. It tends to want to lift the paper off the surface. It doesn't have to lift it much, okay? It might lift only, lift it a couple of millimeters up, and then it falls back down. Okay, so it starts going up with the platen, falls back down, but in that falling back down, there's a good chance that it caused the ghosting that you see here. Okay, so how do we remedy that? Well, we're going to see. Now, let me show what gassing out is too real quick. That's ghosting. Gassing out, kind of a similar thing happening. You can see here there's a streak of blue and there's a streak of orange, and that burst of ink here wasn't because the transfer moved, it's because the transfer wasn't firmly in place, and because all the transfer was pressed down except one place it was not quite firm against the surface, that gas was able to slide out from under that transfer and cause this right here, okay? So this is what we call gassing out. All right, so knowing what causes it leads to being able to solve it, okay? And what's causing it is transfer paper shifts during pressing. Okay, covered that pretty well. Maybe it's not firmly against the substrate during pressing. That's the gassing out. So we covered that. The substrate itself shifts, but it's unlikely to shift without the paper going with it. Possible, I guess. And then dirty blowout sheet. Remember, you're using either Teflon or paper on top of what we call a blowout sheet. And the purpose of the blowout sheet is to prevent any stray ink or gas from the ink from getting onto the platen of the heat press. Okay, so we're covering it, and it contains, and prevents it from getting ink onto the upper heat press platen. And we don't want it there, because if we press another item and the heat press platen is dirty or has extra ink on it, then it may transfer that gas onto the next item. So having a blowout sheet prevents anything from getting on there in the first place, but it also prevents any dirt from the platen from getting onto what we're sublimating, okay? Blowout sheets can get dirty, especially those Teflon. People get that Teflon and think it lasts forever. No, it doesn't. It may only last 1 or 2 cycles before it's actually got ink on it, and that becomes a problem. If you're using paper, which we really recommend, paper being craft paper, butcher paper, newsprint, the type of paper you wrap your dishes in when you're moving, you know, those types of things, you change that sheet out every time. You use that piece of paper one time, and you'll be surprised. Look at that paper. You'll see ink on it, okay? So having a dirty blowout sheet, like the Teflon using it over and over, that can cause the same effect. It looks like ghosting. It's not really, but it is in a way. Or not using one at all and having a dirty platen, okay? So we want to make sure that. But here's how we really want to resolve it, okay? And that is to secure the transfer to the substrate. And we do that one of 2 ways. We either use the heat tape, usually for hard substrates, or we can use a repositionable spray adhesive that's usually for soft substrates, okay? And I'll give you an actual number of one that I really like a little bit further into the presentation. But this is what we want to do, is secure that transfer onto the substrate, okay? And then always use clean blowout sheets. Those are the 2 key things to do. Secure it. That way it's not going to shift anyway, and then make sure our blowout sheets are clean or they're being replaced routinely. Now that brings us to transfer lines. And then apparel, really apparel is probably one of the hardest things to do. And I've done entire webinars on apparel, so I'm going to go kind of fast on this. You can always welcome to go back and look in graphic detail, because I want to try and condense it and move along here. All right, a transfer line, you can see it in the image there. You see that this is where the edge of the paper came in contact with the shirt, and it left a permanent, and I mean permanent, you know, indention right there. You cannot get rid of it. Okay, simple as that. So you got to prevent it from happening. It's really the result of the shirt fibers just beginning to melt, not like melt ooey gooey, but just starting to melt, soften up a little bit, edge of the transfer sheet digging in, and it leaves a permanent impression. And of course, like I said, they are permanent. Now, the way to deal with this is with the foam kits. Okay, I'm a big fan of the foam kits. I haven't used the pillows. I know some people use the pillows, and that's fine. I'm a foam kit kind of guy. And Vapor Apparel is the one who created this. It'll work with products other than theirs, but the key is that high temperature foam in there. Okay, and you can find it through most of the sublimation dealers. And the kit will include foam, the Teflon sheet, some sample shirts for testing, and all the instructions, plus we have them online too. All right, here's how it works. The first thing we want to do is we want to cut foam down to the right size. The foam needs to be larger than the image, smaller than the paper. Very simple, larger than the image, smaller than the paper. So what I've done here is I've just used a Sharpie and actually traced the edges of the paper so I can see the size of the paper, and then I need to make it smaller than the actual sizes of the paper. And so what I did there was lift it off, and then I measured just inside of it so that I knew that my final cut would be smaller than the shirt, okay? So, excuse me, smaller than the paper. Okay, so you want to cut the foam so it's about a 1/2 inch shorter in all directions. Basically, that's how it's going to come out. All right. So once you go to cut it, it doesn't have to look pretty. You just cut it, and you also need to bevel the edges. So we try to bevel the top edge of the foam to about 45 degrees. So there is a bevel in here. Again, you're doing it with scissors. It doesn't have to be neat or pretty. All right, now we go back and we test it out and make sure that it fits, and in this case it does fit. You can see it is smaller than the paper, but it is larger than the image. Now I'm going to kind of build a sandwich, okay? So I'm going to place the foam on the platen, the lower platen, with a beveled side up. At this point too, I might go ahead and make my settings. Now this is where it gets very non-traditional, okay? Because we're going to use 35 to 45 seconds, 380 to 390 degrees, and we're going to have a very, very, very light compression. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Now, these will vary depending on the product that you're working with. These are the numbers that I typically start with, and then I may fine-tune it. You really want to have the time as close as you could to 60, the temperature as close as you could to 400. You know, you want to go towards those settings, but those settings are contributing to that transfer line, so we got to start with lower settings and kind of work from there. All right, so how do we set the pressure? That's one of the most important parts, and here's why we do it. We take that piece of foam, we put it in here all by itself, we close the heat press, and we verify that the foam is not compressed by any more than half of its original height. Okay, that means the top platen doesn't even touch the bottom. I mean, it's amazingly low pressure. It kind of freaks people out sometimes, all right? But that's where we adjust our pressure, so when it's closed, it only compresses the foam by half. I actually keep a little rectangular block of foam next to the heat press for easy reference, okay? But it's nice. It gives you a good visual indication of the right pressure. Okay, remember that piece of foam that we laid on the bottom platen? Typically on top of that, we put a sheet of Teflon, which actually comes with the kit. So you put the Teflon over the foam. You also want to get a lint roller and then roll that over any area on the shirt before we put the shirt over here on the heat press. We want to pick up any lint or unseen particles. Failure to do so, you might get what we call the dreaded blue specks. So just roll over the surface. Anything that will be under the heat press should be rolled with the lint roller. All right, now I'm going to lay the shirt on top of the foam. I'm not going to stuff the foam in the shirt. I'm laying the foam on top, say that again. I'm laying the shirt on top of the foam. Okay, and you can see it. You can actually see the foam with the shirt, by the way, it drapes over it. So that helps you to line up your transfer. So once we got that in place, we are able to go to our transfer and lay the transfer on the shirt. Now this is where I'm going to use, and I give you some sources, that repositionable textile spray adhesive. And what you want to do is you want to spray the transfer, not the shirt. Very, very light, and a distance of maybe 18 to 24 inches away from the surface. Very light. You don't want to glue anything together. You just want to make it a little bit tacky. So you spray onto the transfer. I found the Albatross 1077 works really well. And I've used it on things that are actually some hard surface products. I've used it on some wooden plaques, and it actually worked pretty good. The 3M spray mount, you can get this at Walmart. It works good on apparel, but it doesn't necessarily work good on the hard products. And you definitely want to experiment maybe with some of the sprays so you find something you're comfortable with. But, I've used both of these successfully on apparel. Doing so is going to eliminate your ghosting issues because it's going to make sure the transfer stays on the shirt when we open the heat press. Okay, now we're going to place the transfer on the shirt, and if we didn't put too much of that sticky stuff on there, then we can move the transfer around to line things up. If we put too much, we can't line things up properly. So you want to position it on the shirt. Then cover that with another sheet of Teflon or newsprint, okay, and one more there across the top. And make sure the pressing parameters are correct, and then go press it, okay? Once we open it, immediately pull the transfer paper off while it's hot as fast as you can. Put one hand on the shirt to keep the shirt from moving, and then take one corner of the transfer paper and then just peel it away. Okay, don't start peeling it and then drop it back on the shirt. Not good. Remember, it is hot. Okay, so if you do it right, you shouldn't have any transfer lines and you shouldn't have any ghosting on this. And if you use lint roll, you shouldn't have any blue specks. Okay. All right, summing it all up, knowledge really is everything. So the more you can just learn and understand about the process, it will help you to troubleshoot. So research reliable sources to broaden your knowledge, learn from experience, document what you learn, and create your own knowledge base to refer back to. And don't hesitate to contact people who are experts that can help you through some of your problems, okay? A couple of sources great resource is the resources section of the Sawgrass website. That is just what you're going to find a lot of things that can help you out there, okay? All right, so that wraps up what I wanted to cover here, and there's my contact information if you need that.